Despised, discarded, and desired. The billionaire's debt of honor. Stop! Have you ever wondered if fate has a cruel way of collecting on the debts of our past? What would you do if the person you once despised became the only thing you ever longed for? Hit that subscribe button and like this video right now, because the story of Richard Sterling will change the way you look at success forever. The night the walls fell. Richard Sterling was a name that echoed through the boardrooms of Manhattan, a synonym for power, control, and insatiable ambition. His voice could silence a room, his signature moved markets, and his presence inspired equal parts fear and awe. He built his life on the unshakable belief that nothing could disturb the empire he had meticulously raised. But power had hardened him. It stripped away the vulnerability of the young man he used to be, leaving behind a man with zero tolerance for weakness. That was the man Elena had fallen in love with. In the beginning, she saw glimpses of tenderness beneath his arrogance. But one night, when everything collapsed, Richard revealed a side of himself she never wanted to believe was real. It started with an argument. Elena could no longer remember the words that lit the spark. Only Richard's hardened face, his jaw tight, his eyes flashing with a coldness he had never directed at her before. In his mind, her presence had become a liability, her love a burden, her very existence a crack in the walls of power he had built. When he grabbed her suitcase and threw it into the hallway of their luxury penthouse with a force that nearly made her trip, Elena realized this wasn't just a fight. It was an irreparable break. She watched in disbelief as he shoved her toward the door. The sound of the impact against the pavement outside felt like a final verdict. "Leave!" he roared, his voice sharp and ruthless. "And never come back!" The heavy door slammed, shaking the walls. Elena stood in the shadows of the skyscraper, the city lights mocking her. Her suitcase lay mangled on the sidewalk, her life scattered like the pieces of her heart. She knelt to pick them up, tears falling silently on the clothes she had once packed with the hope of a shared future. But as despair threatened to consume her, a quiet, unshakable strength stirred. She wasn't just Elena, the woman who loved Richard Sterling. She was Elena, the woman who would protect the tiny life growing inside her. She pressed a trembling hand to her belly, whispering comfort to the child, who would never know the rejection of that night. Only her fierce, unwavering love. She walked away, unaware that her absence would one day be the very thing that destroyed him. Viewer question: if you were Elena, would you have ever tried to tell Richard about the baby after that night? Or is some behavior unforgivable? Let us know in the comments. Act 1. The Descent into Truth. Elena's departure wasn't a dramatic flight into a bright new future, but a slow, painful descent into a life she never planned. She found a small, cheap room in a boarding house on the outskirts of the city. The air smelled of dampness, and the furniture was worn, but it was a roof. She lay awake on a lumpy mattress, promising the child within her that they weren't alone. Every day was a battle for survival. For years, Richard had pulled her into a world where money was an afterthought. Now, she was choosing between a bus pass and a loaf of bread. She worked at a diner, taking exhausting night shifts until her pregnancy made it impossible, then switched to mornings. She endured the whispers about the single mother-to-be with silence. Pride had no place here. Survival was all that mattered. When her daughters were born, two perfect twin girls with dark hair and those same piercing blue eyes she had once loved in Richard, Elena felt both her greatest heartbreak and her greatest joy. She named them Sophie and Lucia. Holding them, she realized her rejection didn't matter anymore. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for them. Life as a single mother was relentless. She learned to stretch one meal into two, to sew dresses from second-hand fabric, and to find laughter in the midst of exhaustion. Neighbors who used to gossip now admired her resilience, offering hand-me-downs or watching the girls for an hour so she could work an extra shift. As the years passed, Elena transformed. She was no longer the girl who was kicked out with a broken heart. She was a mother who carried 2 daughters through every storm. What Elena didn't know was that on the other side of the city, Richard was beginning to feel the cracks in his world. The solitude he had chosen was becoming unbearable. He told himself he had done the right thing, but when he looked in the mirror, he no longer recognized the man staring back. He had power, he had wealth, but he lacked the very thing Elena had found in her sacrifice. Act 2. The reflection in the mirror. As the years rolled on, Sophie and Lucia became the center of Elena's universe. By age 2, their personalities emerged vividly. Sophie was bold and curious. Lucia was cautious and observant. Yet in both, Elena saw those blue, piercing eyes, the mirror of a man she tried every day to forget. It was both a torment and a gift. Her mornings began before dawn, preparing breakfast while the girls babbled. She dressed them in clothes she had mended late at night, then walked them to daycare before her shift at a hotel, where she spent long hours cleaning rooms. Every night when she returned, and her daughters ran to her with shrieks of joy, the weight of the world vanished. But sometimes the questions started. They watched other children in the park with their fathers. They saw classmates being picked up by both parents. One afternoon, while reading a bedtime story, Lucia finally spoke. "Mommy, why don't we have a daddy?" The question hit Elena like a punch. She stroked Lucia's hair and replied as sweetly as possible, "Some daddies aren't ready to be daddies, but that doesn't mean you aren't loved." Sophie looked up and asked, "But will we ever meet him?" Elena's heart shrank. "I don't know, my loves, but you will always have me." Elena sat by the window that night, hating Richard for choosing his pride over them, but also hating herself for the tiny spark of hope she still carried. Did he ever think of her? Did he ever imagine the children who bore his face? Don't forget to like this video if you think Elena is a true hero. Your support keeps these stories alive. Act 3. The airport encounter. The day that changed everything for Richard arrived unannounced. He was at O'Hare International Airport, moving quickly through the terminal with his entourage. Airports were familiar territory, places of transition, never revelation. But that day, as he adjusted his cufflinks, his gaze drifted across the waiting area and stopped on a scene so ordinary, yet so devastating, it nearly brought him to his knees. Standing by the large glass windows was a woman he hadn't seen in years. Elena. She was older, stronger, her hair catching the light with a silent glow. She held her chin high, but he could see the traces of struggle in the faint lines around her eyes. For a moment, he thought he was hallucinating, until the sound of laughter shattered his disbelief. 2 little girls were scurrying around her legs, clutching tiny backpacks and pointing at the planes. They were identical, but it wasn't their resemblance to each other that froze Richard to the spot. It was their resemblance to him. The dark hair, the piercing blue eyes full of wonder, the very shape of their faces. The undeniable truth struck him. These were his daughters, daughters he had never known, never touched, never named. The ultrasound he had refused to see years ago was now standing before him, in the form of 2 living, breathing children. Richard couldn't move. His entourage continued without him, their voices fading into the background. Elena looked up then, as if sensing his presence. Their eyes locked across the crowded terminal. Time ceased to exist. He saw the recognition in her eyes, followed by the tightening of her jaw and the protective way she grabbed the girl's hands. There was no greeting, only a wall of defiance. Richard wanted to call her name, to step toward the daughters who looked at him with curious eyes, but his throat tightened. For the first time since his youth, Richard Sterling was afraid. Elena didn't give him a chance to recover. With deliberate steps, she guided the girls away from the window, her eyes never leaving his until the last moment. Her gaze sent a clear message. You do not belong in this world we built. They disappeared into the crowd, leaving him paralyzed. He stayed silent long after his flight was announced, a hollow void opening in his chest. He had spent years believing he was above the consequences of emotion. But here he was, undone by the sight of two little girls whose existence proved he had been wrong all along. Act 4. The humble doorstep. Richard left the airport that day with a weight heavier than any failed business deal. He sat in the back of his limo, the leather seats feeling cold and unwelcoming. He relived every detail. Elena's warning glare, the girls' curious looks, the pure sound of their laughter. He was drowning in questions he didn't know how to answer. His penthouse felt like a prison. He sat in the dark, staring at his reflection in the glass. He no longer saw the polished CEO. He saw the emptiness behind his blue eyes. Over the next few weeks, he used his resources to find her. When he learned of the modest apartment she called home, and the long hours she worked to keep food on the table, something inside him broke. The pride that had kept him distant began to crumble, replaced by a desperate need to fix things. He wanted to know them. He wanted to hear their laughter. He wanted to be the father they never had. When he finally stood before the modest building where Elena lived, the difference between their worlds hit him like a slap. His polished shoes and tailored suit looked absurd on the cracked sidewalk. He hesitated, rehearsing words in his head, but every apology felt inadequate. Elena opened the door. Her expression hardened instantly. She stepped out, closing the door behind her to shield the girls from his presence. "You have no right to be here," she said, her voice low but firm. "You have no right to show up after all these years and think you can undo what you did." Richard did the only thing he could. He admitted his weakness. He told her he was wrong, that his pride had blinded him, and that he wanted to be part of his daughter's future. He didn't use charm or power. He let the words fall raw and broken. Elena listened with crossed arms. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. Finally, she spoke. "They don't even know you exist. They don't know what you did to me. I won't let you walk in and break them the same way you broke me." She turned to leave, but Richard begged. He told her he wasn't asking for forgiveness. Not yet. He just wanted the chance to prove he wasn't the man who had cast them aside. He confessed he was afraid to live and die without ever hearing his children call him father. Elena looked at him, and for a fleeting second, her resolve flickered. She told him he had a long road ahead, that words meant nothing without proof. She wouldn't let him near them until she believed he was capable of love, not control. She went back inside, the click of the lock sounding louder than any rejection he had ever faced. Viewer question: if you were Elena, what act of Richard's would you need to see to start trusting him again? Is time enough, or does it take something bigger? Tell us in the comments. Act 5. The reconstruction of a family. The weeks turned into months. Richard began to live not for acquisitions, but for the fragile chance to stand beside his daughters. He began discreetly. He donated anonymously to their school to ensure they had new books and working computers. He stepped back from the demands of his company, delegating the control he used to hoard. His greatest test came when Elena finally allowed him to see the girls from a distance in the park. She warned him not to approach, not to say a word, just to observe. Watching them run across the grass, their laughter carried by the wind, Richard's heart ached with a longing so fierce he almost fell to his knees. Sophie climbed the jungle gym with fearless determination. Lucia helped a smaller child up a step with patient tenderness. They were undeniably his, yet entirely Elena's. Slowly, Elena allowed more. A meeting at a cafe. They sat across from him, studying him with big, curious eyes. At first, they barely spoke, but Richard didn't press. He answered their questions, told them stories of his childhood, and listened more than he talked. He found himself laughing in ways he had forgotten, a genuine, unreserved sound. The moment that truly broke him came one afternoon when he was walking them back to Elena's car. Sophie slid her hand into his without hesitation, her tiny fingers curling around his as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lucia followed a moment later, pulling on his sleeve and asking softly if he'd be back tomorrow. The innocence of their trust undone him. Elena watched him during these months, her heart softening as she saw the transformation. This wasn't the Richard she knew. This was a man stripped of arrogance, learning humility through the eyes of two girls who demanded nothing but honesty and love. One evening, while the girls slept, Elena and Richard sat together at her kitchen table. No yelling, no bitterness, just the weight of everything that had passed. Richard told her he would spend the rest of his life proving he wasn't that man anymore. For the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to believe that people could change, that even the deepest wounds could heal if nurtured with care. Part 6. The Shadow of the Past. A Dangerous Game. Wait, you thought the story ended with a happily ever after? You couldn't be more wrong. A secret buried for 6 years is about to resurface. Subscribe now and hit that like button because things are about to get dark. The Uninvited Guest. Life in the suburbs of Chicago was peaceful. Richard had traded his tailored suits for sweaters and spent his weekends coaching the girls' soccer team. The Ice King of Manhattan had finally melted. But one foggy Tuesday evening, while Elena was at a community meeting and the twins were at a sleepover at their grandmother's, Richard's past came knocking. Literally, Ahmet was standing on his porch. He was lean, wearing a high-end trench coat and holding a digital tablet. It was Julian Vane, the successor Richard had hand-picked to lead his former empire. But Julian didn't look like a man coming for business advice. He looked like a predator. "What are you doing here, Julian?" Richard asked, his voice low and cautious. "I'm retired." "Retired? Or hiding, Richard?" Julian smirked, tapping his tablet. "I found something in the archives. Something you deleted, but our forensic team recovered. A set of medical records from 6 years ago. Records belonging to Elena." Richard felt a cold sweat break on his neck. "Leave her out of this." "Oh, I think she's very much a part of this." Julian leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "You didn't just throw her out that night, did you? You signed a document, a private settlement that authorized a medical intervention, a document she never saw, a document that could send you to federal prison for a very long time if the truth about those girls' origin ever came out." "What do you want?" Richard hissed. "The company is struggling, Richard. I need your influence back. I need you to sign over your remaining private holdings, or I'll give this file to Elena. I wonder, will she still look at you with love when she finds out you played God with her life?" Act 1. The breaking point. Richard stood frozen as Julian disappeared into the fog. His heart, once healed, was now bleeding with a new kind of terror. He looked around his warm, beautifully decorated living room, the photos of Sophie and Lucia, the architectural drawings Elena had been working on. If he lost them now, he wouldn't survive it. But the choice was impossible. If he gave Julian his holdings, he would fund Julian's ruthless expansion that would destroy thousands of small businesses. If he didn't, Julian would destroy the trust Elena had so painstakingly rebuilt. When Elena returned home an hour later, she found Richard sitting in the dark. She sensed the shift immediately. "Richard, what's wrong? Is it the business?" Richard looked at her, the woman who had become his moral compass. He wanted to lie. Every instinct of the old Richard Sterling told him to manipulate the situation, to pay off Julian, to bury the secret deeper. But then he looked at the butterfly drawing little Leo had given him, the one about trusting. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling, "I need to tell you about the night I threw you out. Something I didn't even fully realize I had done until today," he confessed. He told her that in his blind rage and arrogance 6 years ago, he had signed papers without reading them, papers that gave his legal team the power to handle the situation. He hadn't known Julian had used those papers to interfere with her medical care at the clinic where she found out she was pregnant. He hadn't known he was a monster by proxy. Elena sat in silence. The warmth in the room seemed to evaporate. She looked at Richard as if he were a stranger again. "You're telling me that even our daughters' lives started as a business move for you?" "No, I didn't know," Richard cried. "But Julian has the proof that my signature is on it. He's blackmailing me." Viewer. Question: should Elena forgive Richard for a crime he signed off on, but didn't intentionally commit? Or is this the ultimate betrayal? Comment forgive or leave a Act 2. The counter-strike. For 2 days, Elena didn't speak to him. She stayed in the guest room, the door locked. Richard stayed in his study, not to work, but to plan. He realized Julian had made one fatal mistake. He thought Richard was still the man who valued money over everything else. On the third morning, Elena came out. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was set with that same iron will that had kept her twins alive for 6 years. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way, Richard," she said coldly. "But I won't let that man destroy what we've built. I spent years in the shadows. I'm not going back." "What are you saying?" Richard asked. "We don't pay him. We destroy him." Richard and Elena, the architect and the strategist, began to work together. Richard reached out to his old contacts, while Elena used her NGO's network. They discovered Julian hadn't just been blackmailing Richard. He had been embezzling from the company's charity funds to cover his own losses. The confrontation happened at the annual shareholders' meeting in New York. Julian was on stage, preparing to announce the merger that would solidify his power. Richard walked through the back doors, not in a limo, but in a simple taxi. Beside him was Elena. Julian saw them and smirked, confident. He mouthed the words, "Last chance." Richard didn't walk to the stage. He walked to the tech booth. On the giant screens behind Julian, instead of the merger details, a video began to play. It was an audio recording of Julian's blackmail attempt at Richard's house, followed by a detailed audit of Julian's embezzlement. The room went into an uproar. Julian's face turned from smug to pale. "You're ruined, Richard!" Julian screamed into the microphone. "I'll release the medical files. Everyone will know what you did to her." Elena walked onto the stage then. She took the microphone from Julian's shaking hand. She looked out at the sea of Manhattan's elite, the people who had once pitied her. "I already know," she said, her voice echoing with a power that silenced the room. "And I have already forgiven him. Because unlike you, Julian, Richard Sterling learned how to be a human being. My daughters are not a liability. They are the only thing in this room that isn't for sale." The twist. The price of redemption, Julian was escorted out by security in handcuffs. The Sterling scandal was the headline of every newspaper the next day. But Richard didn't care about the news. Back in Chicago, as the sun set over the lake, Richard and Elena sat on the porch. The threat was gone, but the scar remained. Richard had officially signed over all his holdings to the NGO, leaving them with just enough for a comfortable, modest life. He was no longer a billionaire. He was just Richard. "Why did you do it, Elena?" he asked. "Why didn't you just let him destroy me? You would have had everything." Elena looked at her daughters playing in the yard. "Because if I let him destroy you, I would have lost the man who coached that soccer game last Saturday. And my daughters need that man more than they need a trust fund." She took his hand. It wasn't a full reconciliation yet. The path would be long, but the wall was down. "But Richard," she added, her eyes flashing with a bit of the old fire, "if you ever sign a document without reading it again, I'll throw you out myself." Richard laughed, a deep, honest sound. "Deal." As the stars came out, the house was filled with the sounds of a family that had survived the ultimate test. They had learned that the truth doesn't just hurt. It sets you free. Part 7. The Final Stand. Beyond Blood and Billionaires and Top. This is it. The grand finale of the Sterling saga. You think the threats are over? A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous predator. Hit that subscribe button and like this video right now to witness the shocking conclusion. The empty playground. The tranquility of their life in the suburbs was shattered on a Tuesday morning. Richard had just finished a call with the NGO when he noticed the front gate was unlatched. His heart plummeted. Elena was at the hospital for a checkup, and the twins were supposed to be in the backyard. He ran outside. Their names. "Sophie! Lucia!" Silence. The only thing left on the grass was Sophie's favorite butterfly drawing, now trampled in the mud. And next to it, a burner phone. It rang the second Richard picked it up. "I told you, Richard. If I can't have the empire, you can't have the legacy." It was Julian Vane. His voice was frantic, ragged, the sound of a man who had escaped police custody and had nothing left but vengeance. "I'm at the old Sterling Steel foundry. Come alone. If I see a single police car, the girls find out what it's like to be discarded, just like you discarded their mother." Act 1. The Foundry of Fate. Richard didn't call the police. He knew Julian. Julian wasn't looking for money anymore. He was looking for a sacrifice. Richard drove like a madman to the industrial outskirts of Chicago, to the very foundry where his grandfather had started the Sterling wealth. He found Julian on the rusted catwalk, 30 feet above the concrete floor. Sophie and Lucia were tied to the railing, their eyes wide with terror, but silent, just as Elena had taught them to be in danger. "Let them go, Julian!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "This is between us." "Is it?" Julian laughed, a hollow, manic sound. "You want to be a hero now? The great Richard Sterling, the man of the people? You're a fraud. You built your life on the bones of people like me." Julian stepped closer to the girls, a flare gun in his hand. "Do you want to know the real reason I found those medical files, Richard? It wasn't just to blackmail you. It was because I realized the clinic Elena went to wasn't just any clinic. It was a Sterling subsidiary. And the donor Elena used, the one she thought was anonymous?" Richard felt the world tilt. "What are you talking about? The records weren't just about intervention, Richard. They were about a match. Your father, Arthur, knew you were sterile. He couldn't stand the idea of the Sterling bloodline ending. So when Elena went to that clinic, he didn't just handle it. He ensured the donor was someone with the Sterling DNA, someone you never knew existed." "My father had another son?" Richard whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Me, Richard! I'm your half-brother!" Julian screamed. "The bastard son Arthur kept in the shadows to run his dirty errands. Sophie and Lucia, they aren't just your daughters by choice. They are Sterling's by blood, my blood, and I'd rather see them burn than let you keep them." Viewer question. Does this blood connection change everything? Should Julian have a right to the girls, or does blood mean nothing compared to love, meant blood or heart below? Act 2. The Sacrifice. The shock nearly paralyzed Richard, but then he looked at Lucia. She was staring at him, her blue eyes, sterling eyes, pleading. In that moment, Richard didn't care if they were his nieces, his sisters, or his biological children. They were his heart. "You're right, Julian," Richard said, stepping onto the catwalk. He held his hands up, unarmed. "Arthur was a monster. He used both of us. He kept you in the dark, and he kept me in a cage. But don't be like him. Don't use innocent children to pay back a dead man's debt." Julian hesitated, the flare gun wavering. "If you want the legacy, take it," Richard continued, walking slowly toward the girls. "I've signed everything over to the NGO, but I can reverse it. I'll give you the accounts. I'll give you the name. Just let me take their place." "You'd give it all up? Truly?" Julian sneered. "I already did," Richard said, now only feet away. "Because I found something you never will. I found peace." As Julian looked down at the documents Richard pulled from his pocket, Richard lunged. He didn't go for Julian. He threw his body over the twins, shielding them as Julian fired the flare gun in a panic. The catwalk erupted in sparks. The old structure groaned. Richard felt a searing pain in his shoulder, but he didn't let go of the girls. He used a pocket knife to saw through their ropes. "Run!" he hissed. "To the stairs, now!" The conclusion. The true architect. By the time the police, called secretly by Elena who had tracked Richard's car, arrived, the foundry was in flames. Julian Vane was apprehended trying to flee the back exit. Richard staggered out of the smoke, carrying both girls in his arms. He collapsed onto the wet gravel, just as Elena's car screeched to a halt. Hours later, at the hospital, Richard sat with a bandaged shoulder. Elena sat beside him, the truth about Julian and his father hanging in the air. "You knew, didn't you?" Richard asked softly. "About the Sterling connection?" Elena looked at her daughters, who were finally asleep in the hospital bed. "I suspected, after I saw how Julian looked at them at the gala. But Richard, it doesn't matter. Blood is just an ingredient. You are the one who built the home." Richard looked at his hands. They were scarred, burnt, and no longer held a billionaire's pen. But when Sophie stirred in her sleep and reached out to grab his thumb, he knew he was the richest man in the world. The Sterling Empire was gone. The name was tainted. But the family was whole. Richard Sterling, the man who once threw his wife out for being a distraction, finally understood the most important architectural principle of all. A structure is only as strong as the love that lives inside it. Part 8. The Price of Silence. The Ghost in the Garden. Stop. You think the fire at the foundry ended the nightmare? You're wrong. The Sterling name is gone. But the secrets Elena kept for 7 years are just beginning to surface. Hit that subscribe button and like this video because the real truth is about to be revealed. The hook. The letter from the grave. 6 months after the fire, the Sterling Steel Foundry was nothing but a scorched memory. Richard and Elena had moved even further away, to a quiet cottage in the rolling hills of Vermont. Richard's shoulder had healed, but his soul was finally at rest. Or so he thought. One rainy Monday, while digging a new flower bed for Elena, Richard's shovel hit something hard. A metal box. Rusted, locked, and buried deep under an old oak tree that had stood long before they arrived. Inside wasn't jewelry or money. It was a single, yellowed envelope addressed to the woman who carries the Sterling future. The handwriting was sharp, authoritative, and chillingly familiar. It was from Arthur Sterling, Richard's father, but the letter wasn't for Richard. It was a confession meant for Elena, written weeks before Arthur died. Act 1. The Hidden Covenant. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his breath hitching as he read the words alongside Elena. The letter revealed a truth far more twisted than Julian Vane's blackmail. Arthur hadn't just ensured the donor was a Sterling DNA match. He had made a secret pact with Elena's own father, the man she claimed was a sick alcoholic. The letter stated, "Elena, your father didn't just disappear. He sold your silence. He knew Richard would throw you out. He knew I needed an heir. He took $5 million to ensure you would never tell Richard the truth about the night you were conceived. You aren't just a girl from the outskirts, Elena. You are the daughter of the man who almost bankrupted the Sterling Empire 30 years ago." Richard looked at Elena. Her face was a mask of shock. "Elena, what is this? Your father? And mine?" Elena's voice was a whisper. "I didn't know, Richard. I thought my father left because he couldn't handle my mother's illness. I didn't know he was a player in this game." But the shock was interrupted by a shadow on the porch. A man stood there, wearing a familiar ring. The signet of the Hayes family, the rivals Arthur had mentioned. "It's time to collect the interest on that $5 million, Elena," the stranger said through the glass. Viewer question. Was Elena's father a victim of Arthur Sterling, or was he a traitor to his own daughter? Should Richard trust Elena now that her family's rivalry has come to light? Comment trust or doubt below. Act 2. The rivals return. The man was Elias Hayes, Elena's long-lost brother. Not the soldier Caleb she had introduced Richard to, but the real Elias. He explained that Caleb was just a paid protector. A friend from her past used to keep the Sterling family away. The Hayes family didn't lose Richard, Elias sneered, stepping into the warm kitchen. "We just waited. My father took Arthur's money to fund our comeback. And now, these two girls, Sophie and Lucia, they are the keys to the Hayes-Sterling merger that will crush whatever is left of your legacy." Elias looked at Elena. "You did well, sister. You got close to him. You made him love you. Now, give me the access codes Arthur left in that box. The codes to the offshore accounts he hid from the government." Richard stood up, shielding Elena. "She doesn't know anything about codes, Elias. And I've given everything to the NGO. There is no money left." "Oh, Richard," Elias laughed. "Arthur didn't hide money. He hid information. The patents for the green energy tech that your NGO is using, they don't belong to the NGO. They belong to the Hayes family. And if you don't give me what I want, I'll sue your charity into the ground. Your legacy of kindness will end in a courtroom." Act 3. The architect's counter-move. Richard looked at Elena. For the first time, he saw not a victim, but a woman who had been caught between two warring empires her entire life. "Elias," Elena said, her voice growing steady. "You think you can use me again? Our father used me. Arthur used me. Even Richard once used me as a distraction. But I am not a pawn anymore." She reached into the rusted box and pulled out a smaller hidden compartment. Inside was a digital drive. "Arthur didn't give me codes to money," Elena told her brother. "He gave me the evidence of how the Hayes family stole those patents in the first place. He buried this here because he knew one day you would come looking for a payout. He wanted me to have the power to finish the war he started." Richard realized then that his father, in his final, twisted way, had tried to protect the only person he actually respected, the woman who was strong enough to leave his son. "Leave, Elias," Richard said, his voice cold as the Vermont winter. "Or we release this drive to the SEC. Your comeback will end before the sun goes down." The conclusion: a home built on truth. Elias fled, realizing the Sterling-Hayes war was truly over. He had underestimated the one thing neither of his fathers understood: partnership. That night, Richard and Elena sat by the fireplace. The drive was destroyed. They didn't want the power Arthur offered. They only wanted the truth. "Are we done, Elena?" Richard asked, his head resting on her shoulder. "No more secrets? No more empires?" Elena looked at Sophie and Lucia, who were drawing on the floor, oblivious to the wars fought in their name. We were never an empire, Richard. We are just a family. And for the first time, the foundation is finally solid. Richard Sterling, the man who built skyscrapers, finally realized that the smallest house in Vermont was his greatest achievement. Because it was the only one where the windows were clear and the doors were always open to the truth. The meaningful ending and CTAs, the final vow. The Sterling saga reminds us that silence is a debt that always comes due. But when you face the truth with the person you love, the debt is finally settled. Richard and Elena proved that a family isn't built on bloodlines or bank accounts. It's built on the courage to be honest. The final word. Do you think Richard and Elena can ever truly be happy with so much history between them? Or is there one more secret waiting in the woods? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you followed this story from part 1, you are a legend. Subscribe and hit the bell, because a brand new series starts tomorrow. You won't believe the first episode. Thanks for watching.